New York doesn't go quiet, not unless someone powerful makes it happen. And that night, every street lamp, every shadow, knew the name Lucky Luciano. It was the kind of silence you don't forget. Not the Sunday morning kind. Not the snow fell last night kind. No, this was the hush that comes when something's about to happen, and everyone in the city knows enough to stay out of the way. Lower East Side, 1930-something. Rain had been falling since dusk, slicking the cobblestones until the street lamps looked like they were floating in puddles. The smell of wet asphalt mixed with the bitter tang of cigarette smoke spilling from a corner cafe. And in that haze, behind a smudged window, sat the man nobody dared cross, Charlie Lucky Luciano. He wasn't talking much. Just sitting there, hat tilted low, eyes on the street like a cat watching for movement. Every so often, he'd reach for his coffee but not drink it, just let the steam rise, curling into the cold air between him and the glass. Outside, the world slowed to match his pace. A stray dog padded past, tail down. Two beat cops, collars turned up against the rain, kept their heads low and their eyes lower. Even the trolley clanged softer when it rolled by, as if it knew whose block this was. From across the street, a figure emerged, short coat, quick steps, the kind of walk that meant business. Luciano didn't wave him over. He didn't have to. The guy crossed, hesitated at the cafe door, and slipped inside like he was stepping into a church. "Evenin', Charlie," the man murmured. Luciano didn't look up. "You're late." That's all it took. No threats. No raised voice. Just two words, and the man swallowed whatever excuse he was about to spit out. He sat opposite, hat in his lap, waiting like a schoolboy called to the principal's office. This is how Lucky worked, quiet power. See, he knew noise drew attention, and attention drew heat. So he let silence do the talking. Let people fill it with their own fear. That's how the streets stayed in line. The conversation that followed was low, almost drowned by the rain outside. Something about a shipment from Jersey, a union boss getting jumpy, the cops sniffing around a warehouse they shouldn't know about. Luciano listened. Didn't nod. Didn't blink much. Just took it all in. When the man was finished, Lucky finally leaned back, eyes narrowing just enough to make him flinch. "You tell Benny, the next time a cop knows our business before I do, Benny's gonna wish he didn't." The guy nodded, stammering something about it never happening again. Luciano waved him off, not with his hand, but with his eyes, a dismissal that cut cleaner than any shove. The man stood, tipped his hat, and disappeared back into the rain. Lucky sat a while longer, watching the reflection of the streetlight bend and ripple in the puddles. In moments like this, he wasn't just a boss, he was the city's pulse. And if he stopped beating, the whole neighborhood would flatline. Somewhere down the block, a car backfired. The sound echoed off the brick walls, sharp enough to make a couple of cafe patrons glance up. Not Lucky. He knew the difference between a backfire and a bullet. And besides, if it had been a bullet, it wouldn't have been for him, not tonight. That night was about control. Making sure the message was clear, every deal, every dollar, every whisper on these streets ran through him. You could fight it, but you'd lose. You could try to dodge it, but eventually, you'd find yourself right back under that street lamp, wondering how you got there. The rain slowed to a drizzle, and somewhere uptown, a saxophone began wailing through an open window. It was a soft, lonely sound, drifting down the avenue like smoke. Lucky smiled, just a little, because he knew tomorrow would be loud again. Deals to make. Enemies to manage. Friends to keep close, and even closer in the coffin if they stepped wrong. But tonight was his. A rare moment when the city bowed its head, not out of respect, but because it was too scared to look him in the eye. The waitress came by, nervous fingers playing with her order pad. "Another coffee, Mr. Luciano?" she asked. He shook his head, tossed a couple of bills on the table, more than enough for the coffee he barely touched. "Keep the change," he said, rising in one smooth motion. When Lucky walked out, the bell above the cafe door barely made a sound, but the air outside seemed to shift. People started moving again. Trolleys clanged louder. The city's heartbeat returning to its regular rhythm. And that's the thing about power, real power. It's not about who's the loudest. It's about who can make the world go quiet without ever raising their voice. As Luciano's figure disappeared into the mist, the night reclaimed its usual hum. But if you listen close, you could still hear the echo of his presence in every shadow, every whispered conversation, every cautious step on those slick cobblestones. Some men live in the city. Lucky Luciano made the city live in him. Tomorrow, the headlines would talk about politics, baseball, maybe some fresh scandal uptown. But down here, on these streets, the only news worth knowing was this: Lucky was still in charge, and the night had proved it. Before Lucky was a king, he was just another kid with empty pockets and a full head of dangerous dreams. Before the silk suits, before the nightclubs, before the commission, there was a skinny Sicilian kid named Salvatore Lucania, running barefoot through streets that didn't care if you made it to tomorrow. It was the early 1900s, and New York was bursting at the seams with people who'd come here chasing dreams and found themselves choking on the reality. Tenement blocks stacked on tenement blocks, families crammed into rooms where the walls sweated in summer and froze in winter. Salvatore's family had come over from Lercora Fritti, Sicily, when he was 9. They carried with them little more than hope and a couple of battered suitcases. His father worked long days hauling cement, his mother mended clothes for pennies. They were good people, honest. But in the Lower East Side, honest didn't always keep you fed. The streets were another kind of school. And for Salvatore, the lesson plan was simple: learn fast or get swallowed. Most days, the neighborhood smelled like a mix of fresh bread from the corner bakery and horse manure from the carts that rattled past. Kids played stickball in the alleys, shouting in a dozen different languages. Fights broke out as often as games did, and nobody asked why. Everybody knew the answer was survival. Salvatore learned English the way most immigrant kids did, through scraps of conversation, insults yelled across the street, and the occasional police warning. He was small but quick, both with his feet and his wits. By 12, he was already carrying himself like someone older. Someone who understood that respect was a currency, and you had to earn it fast. He ran errands for shopkeepers, shined shoes, sold newspapers at the ferry docks. But the real money? That came from the games the grown-ups played. Dice in the back of the barber shop. Card games in smoky basements. A little pickpocket work near the theater district when the crowd spilled out after a show. The first time he got caught lifting a wallet, the beat cop just cuffed him on the ear and told him to go home. But home wasn't where Salvatore wanted to be. Home was cramped and tired. The streets, dangerous as they were, offered something else: possibility. That's how he fell in with the neighborhood gangs. Not the kind you read about in penny novels. These weren't all knife fights and bravado. These were networks. Loose, chaotic, but run by older kids who'd learned how to squeeze a little profit from the constant churn of the city. Salvatore was good at finding opportunities. He noticed which shopkeepers were willing to pay for protection, which drunks carried loose bills, which alleys you could vanish into if the cops started sniffing around. And he had another advantage: he could talk to anybody. Italians, Jews, Irish, Greeks. He might not speak their language perfectly, but he could make them laugh, make them listen. That charm got him noticed. By 15, he wasn't just running errands, he was running games. Small ones, sure, but enough to put a few extra coins in his pocket and a little more swagger in his step. It was around this time he started calling himself Charlie. Sounded sharper, more American. He figured if you wanted to run the city, you had to sound like you belonged to it. Still, every day was a tightrope. One wrong move, and you could be laid out in the gutter. Charlie saw it happen often enough: kids he knew getting caught in the crossfire of a beef that wasn't theirs, older boys disappearing after crossing the wrong man. One winter evening, walking home from a card game, Charlie found himself cornered by 3 older boys from a rival block. They wanted his winnings. He could have handed it over, maybe walked away with nothing more than a bruised ego. But he didn't. The fight was quick, dirty. He caught a fist to the jaw, landed a kick that doubled one of them over. In the end, he walked away with a split lip, scraped knuckles, and most of his money still in his pocket. The next day, word spread, not that he'd fought, but that he hadn't folded. That was the first time Charlie understood the power of reputation. Money came and went. But if people believed you couldn't be pushed, they treated you different. In the years that followed, Charlie's world kept expanding. He started working for small-time mobsters, running packages, delivering envelopes stuffed with cash or messages that didn't need to be written down. He learned when to talk, when to keep quiet, and most importantly, how to listen. He paid attention to the men who had real influence, how they dressed, how they never rushed, how they could walk into a room and make it feel smaller just by standing there. But it wasn't all glamour. There were cold nights when he went to bed hungry, days when the cops shook him down just for walking in the wrong neighborhood. He saw friends get locked up, others vanish without a trace. Through it all, Charlie kept moving. Kept learning. Kept his eyes open for the next opportunity. Because here's the thing about the Lower East Side, it chewed up plenty of kids. But the ones it didn't chew up? It turned them into something else entirely. Charlie Lucania wasn't just surviving anymore. He was practicing. Training for the day he wouldn't have to run errands for anybody ever again. The day people would be running errands for him. And somewhere in the back of his mind, the idea was already forming: you didn't have to be the loudest or the toughest. You just had to be the one pulling the strings. That thought would carry him into the next phase of his life, a phase where the risks got bigger, the rooms got smokier, and the stakes, well, they were gonna be life and death. For now, though, he was just a boy in a flat cap, hands shoved in his pockets against the cold, walking streets lit by flickering gas lamps. The city hummed around him, and he hummed back, because deep down, he already knew someday it'd all be his. Lucky didn't need a diploma. The streets taught him everything a boss needs to know, and charged him in blood, not tuition. Charlie Lucania never saw the inside of a high school classroom for long. The walls felt too small, the teachers too slow. Besides, there was more to learn out on the pavement, lessons that didn't come with chalkboards or attendance rolls. His education began in the back rooms of bars, where the curtains stayed drawn no matter the hour. He learned the meaning of respect not from a dictionary, but from the way older men lowered their voices when a real earner walked in. One of the first to take notice of him was an Italian bookmaker named Salvatore Sali Torrio, cousin to the more famous Johnny Torrio, who'd soon make waves in Chicago. Sally ran numbers games and a small network of loan sharks. Charlie started off carrying envelopes for him. Easy work, so long as you didn't peek inside. You don't have to be the smartest, Sally told him one night over a plate of spaghetti in the back of a deli. You just gotta know when to shut up and when to nod. Charlie took it to heart. He became a shadow, seen but not heard, absorbing everything. How Sally negotiated without ever raising his voice. How he could smile at a man while deciding whether to break his legs. There were practical lessons, too. How to spot a plainclothes cop by his shoes. How to tell if you were being tailed. Which bartenders could be trusted to pass along a quiet word, and which would sell you out for a free drink. And then there were the games: poker, craps, three-card Monte. Not just playing them, running them. Charlie learned the art of the skim, taking just enough off the top so the players stayed happy, but the house stayed fat. Every so often, the calm rhythm broke. Like the night a deal went wrong in a warehouse by the docks. Charlie was there to help unload crates supposed to be filled with Canadian whiskey. Instead, they were packed with bottles of colored water. Someone had pulled a fast one. The shouting started in Italian, spilled into English, then back again. A bottle shattered. A knife came out. Sally didn't even blink, just leaned in and whispered to Charlie, "Go find Vinny. Bring the car round." Charlie did as told, but he remembered the scene, the quick calculation in Sally's eyes, the way he stepped between two furious men like he was separating children, even though both could have slit his throat. That was power, not avoiding trouble, but controlling it. By 17, Charlie had his own little crew. They weren't much, just a handful of street kids who knew how to keep their mouths shut and their cuts fair. They ran errands for the bigger guys, collected small debts, kept an eye on the flow of goods into the neighborhood. Charlie also made friends outside his own kind. One of the most important was Meyer Lansky, a wiry, sharp-eyed Jewish kid with a head for numbers and an instinct for survival that matched Charlie's. They met during a street craps game that turned sour. Someone accused Meyer of cheating. Before fists could fly, Charlie stepped in, backed the kid up, and walked him out. Later, over sodas in a corner cafe, they talked about the business, how the Italians had their rackets, the Jews theirs, the Irish theirs. What if, Meyer mused, we stopped fighting over scraps and started working together? It was a thought Charlie filed away. There were setbacks, of course. Nights spent in the back of a paddy wagon. A busted lip here, a black eye there. Once, he spent 2 weeks nursing a cracked rib after taking a beating from a rival gang for crossing the wrong corner. But every scar was a reminder, every arrest, a lesson. He learned to spot a setup before it happened. He learned which cops could be bought and which couldn't. He learned to read people, not just their words, but the flicker in their eyes when they were lying, the twitch in their hands when they were nervous. And all the while, his reputation grew. Not as the toughest kid, there were plenty tougher. Not as the smartest, Meyer probably had him beat there. But as the one who could bring people together, settle disputes, and get things done without bodies piling up on the sidewalk. That skill was rare. And in the underworld, rare meant valuable. By the time he turned 19, Charlie wasn't just running errands anymore. He was moving product, liquor, gambling, whatever brought in cash. His pockets weren't empty these days, and neither was his plate at dinner. He'd come a long way from the hungry kid dodging fights in alleyways. Still, he knew this was just the beginning. The real bosses, the ones whose names you didn't hear in the papers, played on a bigger board. And if Charlie wanted a seat at that table, he'd have to take the next step. Which meant leaving behind the comfort of being a small fish in a small pond and swimming straight into waters full of sharks. In this town, your name is either a whisper or a warning. Lucky made sure it was both. By the early 1920s, Charlie Lucania was done playing in the shallow end. The streets of the Lower East Side had taught him everything they could. Now he was ready for bigger rooms, the kind where the air was thick with cigar smoke, the liquor was top shelf, and every handshake meant either money or trouble. But to get into those rooms, you needed more than hustle. You needed reputation. And Charlie was building his, brick by brick. The first brick came in the form of a man named Arnold Rothstein, the Brain. Rothstein wasn't just a gambler, he was the gambler. The guy who could bankroll a World Series fix and still show up at the track the next day like nothing happened. Through Meyer Lansky, Charlie got an introduction. The meeting was in a back booth of the Parsons Club, a quiet joint uptown. Rothstein didn't waste words. He asked Charlie a couple of questions about liquor distribution, about the risk of moving Canadian whiskey through Jersey, about the cops. Charlie answered each one calmly, like he'd been rehearsing for years. Rothstein leaned back, smirked. "You're a smart kid. I'll give you a piece of something. Don't lose it." That piece was a cut of a shipment worth more money than Charlie's old crew could have dreamed of. He handled it clean, no delays, no heat, no surprises. And just like that, word started to spread, this Lucania kid could be trusted. The second brick came in the form of a man Charlie had already known for years, Meyer Lansky. They'd been working together on small jobs, but now they started thinking bigger. Lansky introduced him to Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, a wiry, fast-talking hothead with a grin as sharp as his trigger finger. Together, the three of them made a strange but deadly combination, Meyer the brains, Bugsy the muscle, Charlie the diplomat who could make the deal stick. They started taking over speakeasies one by one. Not with gunfire, though Bugsy never minded that option, but with charm and pressure. Charlie would walk into a club, order a drink, chat with the owner. By the time he left, that owner was either a partner or planning to sell. Still, the streets didn't let you move up without testing you. And Charlie's test came in the form of Joe the Boss Masuria. Masuria was the reigning king of the Italian underworld in New York, a man who saw every newcomer as either a threat or a pawn. Charlie played it smart. He didn't challenge the old man. Instead, he went to work for him running operations, collecting from clubs, expanding the bootlegging routes. He showed loyalty, kept his head down, but all the while, he was watching. Studying. Because Masuria had enemies. One in particular, Salvatore Maranzano, a Sicilian newcomer looking to carve out his own piece of the city. And in the brewing tension between those two giants, Charlie saw an opportunity. It started with quiet conversations in back alleys and parked cars. Meetings where Charlie would listen more than talk, nodding while Masuria's soldiers complained about low pay, about the constant feuds, about the old man's outdated ways. And then there were the nights spent with Lansky and Siegel, mapping out the future. The old ways are done, Meyer would say, tapping ash into an empty glass. The wars, the vendettas, they're bad for business. We need something modern. Something organized. Charlie agreed. But before they could build the future, they had to survive the present. That meant walking a razor's edge between Masuria and Maranzano. Some nights he'd dine with Joe the Boss, nodding at every boast, sipping wine as the old man bragged about his control of the city. Other nights he'd meet quietly with Maranzano's men, trading information and feeling out their intentions. It was dangerous, too dangerous for most men. But Charlie understood that in the right hands, danger was leverage. The real turning point came one rainy night in 1928. Charlie was walking out of a club on West 54th when a pair of gunmen stepped from the shadows. No words, just the click of safeties coming off. The first bullet grazed his shoulder. The second tore through his leg. He went down, the pavement cold and slick under him. The gunman fired twice more, then ran. Somehow, he lived. 3 weeks in the hospital, and when he came out, he was leaning on a cane, but standing. People started calling him lucky. Some said it was because he'd survived the hit. Others claimed he got the name years earlier playing cards. Charlie never confirmed which story was true. He just smiled that slow, knowing smile and let the legend grow. And grow it did. The attempt on his life gave him an aura, made people think twice before crossing him. After all, if he could survive that, what else could he survive? From then on, his name wasn't just known in the Lower East Side. It was known in Harlem, in Brooklyn, in Jersey. Known in the police precincts, in the speakeasies, in the gambling dens. People started to understand, Charlie Lucky Luciano wasn't just another up-and-comer. He was building something. Quietly. Carefully. And one day, when the dust settled between Masuria and Maranzano, he intended to be the one left standing in the middle. But for now, he played the part of the loyal lieutenant. Smiling when Masuria gave him orders. Nodding when Maranzano's men whispered about the future. Because in this town, the smartest move wasn't always the boldest. Sometimes the smartest move was waiting. In our world, a friend could save your life or sell it for the right price. By the late 1920s, Luciano's world was a chessboard where every piece wore a smile but carried a knife. The bootlegging money was rolling in, the speakeasies were humming, and the politicians were all too happy to look the other way for a price. But under the surface, every handshake came with a question: how long before this guy turns on me? In that world, Lucky had two kinds of relationships, friends and useful people. Sometimes they were the same thing. Sometimes they weren't. Meyer Lansky was a friend. Not because of sentiment, but because the man was steady. He didn't care about glory. He cared about the numbers, about keeping the machine running. Bugsy Siegel? He was a friend too, but the kind you had to keep on a short leash. Bugsy's temper could turn a quiet meeting into a headline. Then there were the others, the rivals you had to smile at in public and watch like a hawk in private. Guys like Vincent Mad Dog Call, who had no code, no restraint. Or Dutch Schultz, who could be your partner on Monday and your problem by Wednesday. Luciano's way of surviving was simple: know the code, and know who else lived by it. The code wasn't written down. It was in the pauses, the eye contact, the way someone reacted when you tested them. It said, don't steal from your own people. Don't talk to the cops. Don't let outsiders in on the business. And above all, respect the man who feeds you. Break the code, and there was no negotiation. You were gone. One night, over dinner in a dimly lit backroom, Luciano sat with Lansky, Siegel, and a few other trusted men. A bottle of Chianti stood between them, the candlelight dancing in their glasses. We're making more money than ever, Meyer said, cutting into his veal. But it won't last if we keep fighting over turf like kids in an alley. Bugsy leaned forward. You saying we should all hold hands and sing songs? That's not how it works. I'm saying, Meyer replied evenly, we need rules. We need to agree on how the game is played. Otherwise, we're just animals. Luciano didn't say much, just let them talk. He'd learned a long time ago that silence, in the right moment, made people reveal more than questions ever could. It wasn't just business smarts that kept him alive. It was reading the temperature in a room, knowing when an ally was drifting toward betrayal, when a rival could be turned into a partner, when a friend was about to make a mistake you'd have to clean up. There was a night when Dutch Schultz came to him with an offer: take over a string of Harlem nightclubs, cut Lansky out of the deal. Dutch grinned like he was handing Luciano the keys to a gold mine. Lucky listened, nodded, and said he'd think about it. When Dutch left, Lucky called Meyer. Told him every word. That was the code. You didn't just protect your friends, you made sure no one could wedge themselves between you. Still, the code had limits. Sometimes, loyalty to business outweighed loyalty to blood. Luciano learned that when an old childhood acquaintance, a small-time collector named Tommy, started skimming from the take. He called Tommy in, poured him a drink, and asked straight, you taking from me? Tommy's eyes darted away. That was answer enough. Lucky didn't shout. Didn't threaten. He just told Tommy to leave the money on the table and walk out. Tommy never worked in the neighborhood again. Some thought Luciano went soft by not having him disappear. But Lucky understood a quiet exile could send just as strong a message as a body in the gutter. The years rolled on, and the alliances shifted like tides. Masuria and Maranzano were circling each other for war, and Luciano was stuck in the middle. But being in the middle had its advantages: you got to hear both sides, see where the cracks formed, and decide which way to lean when the time came. And when that time came, he'd be ready. The friendships he valued, the rivals he tolerated, the code he enforced, all of it was leading to something bigger. A structure that would outlast the bootlegging era, the gang wars, even the men who built it. But first, there were battles to fight, loyalties to test, and a city to control, one block at a time. For now, Luciano kept his friends close, his rivals closer, and his code carved into every decision. Because in his world, trust wasn't given. It was negotiated, renewed, and when necessary, revoked without warning. When America went dry, the streets flowed with money if you were thirsty enough to take it. When the Volstead Act hit in 1920, most people thought prohibition meant the end of booze in America. Lucky Luciano knew better. To him, it wasn't a ban, it was an open invitation. Before the law, liquor was just another commodity. After the law, it became gold. Every glass poured was profit, and every thirsty man was a customer. All you had to do was figure out how to get it to them without landing in a cell. Bootlegging wasn't new. The rum runners had been hauling Caribbean spirits up the coast for years. But prohibition turned a side hustle into a national industry, and Luciano saw the potential immediately. He wasn't the first to move liquor, but he was one of the first to systematize it. No more small-time runs with guys who might drink half the product before delivery. This was going to be a business. A supply chain. Something as reliable as the milkman, but with whiskey. Through Lansky and Bugsy, Lucky tapped into networks that stretched from Canadian distilleries to the speakeasies of Manhattan. Trucks ran on tight schedules, payments moved in envelopes through trusted couriers, and every cop along the route knew whose hand to shake. The nights were alive in those years. If you knew where to look, you could find speakeasies hidden behind soda shops, in basements of tailor stores, even behind the fake walls of law offices. Passwords were whispered at unmarked doors, bouncers sized you up before letting you in, and once you were inside, the world changed. Jazz poured from the corners, the air thick with cigarette smoke and perfume. Women with bobbed hair and flapper dresses laughed over cocktails, men loosened their ties and forgot they had to wake up in the morning. In these rooms, the law didn't matter. What mattered was that the booze kept flowing. And Luciano made sure it did. He didn't just sell to anyone. He cultivated relationships with club owners, bartenders, and entertainers. If you were in Lucky's network, you got the best product, on time, every time. If you weren't, well, you'd find your deliveries mysteriously late, your suppliers suddenly dry. Competition was inevitable. Other outfits, Irish, Jewish, Italian, all wanted a piece of the action. Turf disputes turned into street fights, and street fights turned into shootouts. Luciano hated chaos. It was bad for business. But he wasn't afraid to send a message when someone tried to muscle in. One such message was delivered in the winter of '24. A rival crew hijacked one of his shipments, 6 trucks worth of Canadian rye. Luciano didn't shout. Didn't threaten. He sent word that the whiskey was to be returned untouched within 48 hours. When the deadline passed, the rival boss woke up to find his main warehouse in flames, the smoke visible halfway across the city. By the end of the week, the stolen whiskey was back and Luciano's trucks rolled without interference for months. He was making millions, in today's money, tens of millions. And yet, for all the cash, he kept the operation tight. No paper trails. No unnecessary risks. The money was laundered through legitimate fronts: laundry services, construction companies, restaurants. To the IRS, Lucky Luciano was just another businessman with a taste for good suits. Still, the high life was impossible to hide entirely. Photographs started appearing: Lucky at the racetrack, Lucky at the Copa, Lucky stepping out of a chauffeured car with movie stars on his arm. To the public, he was a charming rogue. To the underworld, he was the man who kept the city wet when the law said dry. But prohibition wasn't just about liquor. It opened doors to other rackets: gambling dens hidden in the back of clubs, protection services for businesses, even influence in unions. If a shipment of whiskey came in, it wasn't unusual for a truckload of slot machines to come with it. The reach extended beyond New York. Luciano's network touched Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston. In some places, he partnered with locals. In others, he bought them out. It wasn't expansion for ego, it was efficiency. The bigger the network, the harder it was for the feds to shut it down. And yet, the bigger it got, the more careful he had to be. Every delivery, every payoff, every handshake was a point of vulnerability. The cops weren't his biggest problem, they could be bought. The real danger came from other gangs. There was one night in '26 when a shipment was delayed coming down from Canada. The driver claimed bad weather, but Luciano suspected something else. He sent Bugsy to check the roads. By dawn, the delay was over, and the driver was back on schedule, quieter, and a little paler. Despite the occasional flare-up, most nights were smooth. The clubs stayed stocked, the customers stayed happy, and the money flowed like the whiskey. Luciano liked to walk the floor of certain speakeasies himself, just to feel the energy. He'd lean at the bar, chat with the bandleader, tip the waitress heavy. To most patrons, he was just another well-dressed man enjoying the night. Only the insiders knew that half the glasses in the room had his fingerprints on them one way or another. And then there were the quiet nights, the ones where he'd sit in a corner booth with Meyer, maps and ledgers spread out between them, calculating routes and profits. "We're not just moving liquor," Meyer would say. "We're building an economy." Luciano knew it wouldn't last forever. Laws changed, politicians came and went, and public opinion could turn on a dime. But for now, prohibition was the best thing that had ever happened to him. It had taken a kid from the Lower East Side and turned him into one of the most powerful men in America. Still, he wasn't blind to the cost. Men died over barrels. Friendships ended over territory. Every fortune built in those years was balanced on a knife's edge. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the music and the laughter, he could hear the first faint sounds of change. A reminder that the gold rush always ends. And when it does, only the smartest survive. One night in 29, Lucky learned the hardest truth of this business: even your closest friends can leave you bleeding in the gutter. In this world, betrayal never comes from across the street. It comes from the table you've been eating at for years. The spring of 1929 was supposed to be a good season for Luciano. Business was steady, the speakeasies were stocked, and the tension between Masuria and Maranzano hadn't yet boiled over. Lucky was doing what he did best, balancing the two sides, making money with both, keeping the peace where he could. And maybe, just maybe, he let himself believe things would stay that way. It was a Tuesday night when the phone call came. An associate, a man Luciano had known for years, said some important guys wanted to talk. Neutral ground. No heat, no agenda. Just business. The meeting spot was an apartment in the Bronx, not one of Luciano's usual haunts. That should have been the first warning. But the guy on the phone? He'd eaten at Lucky's table. Been to his mother's house. A friend. Luciano drove up wearing a light overcoat against the cool night. The city lights faded as he crossed into quieter streets, the kind where shadows seemed to linger a little longer. When he got to the building, everything felt wrong. Too quiet. The doorman wasn't there. The hallway smelled faintly of bleach. And then the door opened, and the world turned red. 3 men rushed him before he could react. One swung a sap, a leather blackjack, across the back of his head. The impact made his vision swim. Hands grabbed his arms, his coat, his shirt. A punch to the ribs, another to the gut. He was dragged outside, shoved into a waiting car. No one said a word. The engine roared, and the city blurred past. They stopped somewhere under the elevated train tracks. The doors yanked open, and they pulled him onto the cold pavement. The beating was methodical, not a brawl, not rage. This was business. Fists, boots, the dull crack of bone. He felt his cheek split, tasted blood so thick it made him choke. A kick caught his jaw, and the world tilted sideways. One of them pulled a knife. Luciano didn't fight, not because he couldn't, but because he knew this wasn't about winning. Not here. Not now. The blade never went in. Maybe they were told not to kill him. Maybe they wanted him alive as a message. Or maybe, and this thought would stick with him for years, maybe the man who ordered it still needed him. When they were done, they tossed him in a ditch off the side of the road like garbage. The car drove away, the taillights fading into the night. He lay there for hours. Couldn't move. Could barely breathe. Every sound, a car door slamming somewhere, a dog barking, felt far away. His mind drifted between pain and cold, his thoughts flickering in and out like a dying light bulb. It was dawn when a passing motorist spotted him and called the cops. The officers recognized him, everyone did by then, and got him to a hospital. The doctors said it was a miracle he was alive. Broken ribs. A fractured skull. Deep cuts. They stitched him, set him, told him to rest. Rest wasn't in his vocabulary. From his hospital bed, Luciano started making calls. Not about revenge, not yet. About information. Who set it up? Who was in the car? Why was he still breathing? The answers came slowly, in whispers. And when they came, they cut deeper than the knife ever could. The man who'd called him that night, the so-called friend, had been working both sides. Masuria's men. Maranzano's men. He'd sold Lucky out for a pile of cash and the promise of protection. That promise wouldn't last. Not in this city. Lying in that hospital bed, Luciano thought about the old Sicilian ways, vendettas, endless wars, loyalty to one boss until death. He thought about how those ways had almost ended him. And that's when the idea started to take shape. No more blood feuds for honor. No more bosses clinging to power until someone put them in the ground. The future had to be different, structured, organized, built on business first. The betrayal hadn't just been a beating. It was a lesson. And Lucky Luciano wasn't the kind of man to waste a lesson. By the time he walked out of that hospital, slow, leaning on a cane, the street saw something different in him. His face still bore the bruises, but his eyes were sharper. Colder. Friends came to pay respects. Rivals came to see if he was weakened. He made sure every one of them left knowing the same thing: Lucky Luciano was still standing. And the next time someone tried to take him down, there wouldn't be a next time. Why fight for scraps when you can build the table everyone eats at and you own the table? The beating in 29 didn't just break bones, it broke Luciano's patience with the old way of doing things. Masuria and Maranzano were locked in their power struggle, bleeding money and men in the name of tradition. And for what? Pride? Ego? The same Sicilian codes that had nearly left him in a ditch. Lucky didn't see himself as a Sicilian don anymore. He saw himself as a businessman. And businessmen didn't start wars, they built monopolies. The first step was survival. When the Castellamarese War broke out between Masuria and Maranzano in 1930, Luciano kept working both sides, just like before. But now, every handshake, every drink, every whispered conversation was part of a larger plan. He started having quiet meetings, not just with Italians, but with Jewish mobsters like Lansky, Siegel, and Dutch Schultz, when Dutch wasn't being a problem. He even opened channels to the Irish outfits. His message was simple: the wars had to stop. There was too much money to be made for it to be wasted on vendettas. Masuria didn't want to hear it. He was old school, believed the Sicilian way was the only way. Loyalty to the boss until death. And Luciano knew that with Joe the boss in the way, the future he imagined couldn't happen. That's when the whispers started: if Masuria was removed, the war could end. Deals could be made. Everyone could make more money. The removal was as clean as it was brutal. April 15, 1931, a card game in Coney Island. Luciano excused himself to the bathroom. By the time he returned, Masuria was slumped over the table, 4 bullets in his body, a cigarette still smoldering between his fingers. With Masuria gone, Maranzano declared himself capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses. For a moment, it seemed Luciano had backed the winning side. But Maranzano was no better than Masuria. Maybe worse. He started reorganizing the families but put himself above them all. He demanded tributes. Gave orders like a king. And he didn't trust Luciano. Word leaked that Maranzano had hired hitmen, disguised as tax agents, to take him out. Lucky didn't wait to see if the rumor was true. September 10, 1931, just 5 months after Masuria's death, Maranzano's office in Manhattan saw its last meeting. 4 of Luciano's men, including Bugsy Siegel, walked in under the guise of a business visit. Minutes later, Maranzano lay dead on the carpet, his reign over before it had truly begun. That was the end of the old way. And the beginning of something entirely new. Luciano called the heads of the major Italian families together. No speeches about honor. No oaths about Sicily. Instead, he laid out a structure, a board of directors for the mafia, the commission. It would consist of the bosses from each family, along with key non-Italian allies like Lansky. No more single boss of all bosses. No more dictating to other families. The commission would mediate disputes, set territory boundaries, and coordinate national operations. Think of it like a corporation, each family was a branch, the commission was the boardroom. And Luciano? He was the chairman without the title. The reaction was mixed. Some saw it as genius, a way to end the constant bloodshed and focus on profit. Others thought it was too radical, too much like doing business with outsiders. But Luciano knew money talked louder than pride. And when the first coordinated ventures brought in record profits, even the skeptics fell in line. Bootlegging was still the backbone, but the commission's reach extended further: gambling dens in Florida, numbers rackets in Harlem, narcotics moving quietly through the docks, labor union infiltration that gave them power over entire industries. Luciano's vision was clear: crime without chaos. Wars only happened if the commission agreed. Hits had to be sanctioned. Disputes went to arbitration, not to the streets. And unlike the old dons, Luciano embraced diversity, at least in business. He didn't care if you were Sicilian, Calabrian, Jewish, or Irish, as long as you made money and kept the rules. It was this willingness to break from tradition that made him untouchable. Politicians, judges, police chiefs all found themselves quietly on his payroll. And for the public, the chaos of the old gang wars seemed to fade, replaced by a quieter, more organized underworld that most people didn't even realize existed. But power like this didn't make him arrogant. It made him cautious. Luciano knew that the moment you started believing you were untouchable, you were already in someone's sights. So he kept his movements deliberate. Meetings in safe locations. Communications through trusted intermediaries. Layers of insulation between himself and the street-level operations. Still, the street always knew who was at the top. If a club opened, it was because Luciano allowed it. If a labor strike was called off overnight, it was because Luciano wanted it. If a man disappeared, it was because he'd broken the rules, and the rules now were his. The commission changed everything. It turned what had been a loose network of feuding gangs into a national syndicate. And it made Lucky Luciano the most influential mobster America had ever seen. But for all its brilliance, the system had one flaw: it relied on everyone playing by the rules. And in the underworld, rules only worked as long as the money kept flowing and the power stayed balanced. Luciano knew it wouldn't last forever. But for now, it was his empire. An empire built not just on muscle, but on vision. On the idea that the future of organized crime wasn't about being the toughest man in the room, it was about being the one who owned the room. And in 1931, Lucky Luciano owned the biggest room in America. The more power you got, the more eyes watching, and not all of them are friendly. By 1932, Luciano had what every street hustler dreams about: money, respect, and the kind of power that didn't need to be shouted. He could stroll into the Waldorf Astoria like he owned it. He could have dinner with judges, then slip into a Harlem nightclub to hear a jazz set until 3 a.m. In the commission's early years, everything seemed balanced: territory disputes cooled, the money flowed, and for the first time in decades, the city's underworld ran like a well-oiled machine. But power has a way of attracting light. And light, in this world, is dangerous. The newspapers had always liked a good gangster story. Names like Al Capone sold papers from Chicago to New York. Luciano had mostly stayed out of the public eye, letting others grab the headlines while he handled business in the shadows. But that was getting harder. Society pages started mentioning him: Charles Luciano, dashing businessman, seen at the Stork Club with Broadway starlets. Photographers caught him stepping out of limousines, wearing suits cut so sharp they looked like they could draw blood. To the public, he was a mystery, the young, charming man with a faint scar on his cheek, always well-dressed, never in a hurry, never quite explaining where his money came from. To law enforcement, he was becoming a name they couldn't ignore. The attention wasn't just from the press. Rival outfits, even those within the commission, started watching him more closely. When a man is that well-connected, people start asking themselves, what happens if he decides he doesn't need us? The answer, of course, was simple. If Lucky didn't need you, you probably wouldn't be around long. But Luciano wasn't reckless. He knew the feds were building files on him. He knew state prosecutors were looking for a crack in the armor. So he doubled down on his insulation. He never personally touched the product, whether it was liquor, numbers, or anything else. He let layers of trusted men handle the dirty work. When he was in public, he was never Lucky Luciano, mob boss. He was Charles Luciano, businessman, investor, socialite. He'd talk about racehorses, about the Yankees, about the weather, anything but the streets. Still, the heat was building. One night in 1935, during a private dinner at a midtown club, a waiter leaned in and whispered that there were two plainclothes cops watching from the bar. Luciano didn't even turn his head. He just poured another glass of Chianti, laughed at a joke Meyer Lansky told, and finished his meal. The cops could watch all they wanted. They wouldn't see anything. That was the point. But publicity was a tricky beast. For every article that painted him as a suave man about town, there was another that hinted at underworld connections and unexplained wealth. Politicians began muttering about cracking down on vice. Reformers were pushing to clean up the city's clubs and gambling dens. And then there was Thomas E. Dewey, the rising prosecutor with a taste for high-profile cases. Dewey didn't want just another arrest, he wanted a name that would put him on the political map. And in the early 1930s, no name was bigger in New York's underworld than Lucky Luciano. Luciano knew about Dewey's ambitions. "Kid wants to be a hero," he told Lansky one night. "Heroes need villains. Guess who he's pickin'?" The tension wasn't just legal. In the underworld, too much success could be dangerous. Some of the old guard still didn't like Luciano's partnership with Jewish and Irish gangs. They called it a betrayal of tradition. To Luciano, it was just good business, but in their eyes, it was a weakness to exploit. He had to balance every move to show strength without provoking war, stay visible enough to maintain his influence, but not so visible that the law could pin something on him. In quieter moments, he thought about the irony. He'd built the commission to keep the streets peaceful, to run the business like a corporation. Now, the biggest threats weren't street hits or turf wars, they were headlines, courtrooms, and men in suits with legal pads. The danger felt different, but it was still danger. And as he'd learned long ago, the only way to survive it was to stay 3 steps ahead. For now, the commission was intact, the money was rolling in, and Luciano's public image was still more mystery than menace. But the shadows were moving, and he could feel the spotlight getting hotter. And he knew one thing about spotlights: sooner or later, they burn. Every empire looks unshakable right before it crumbles. By 1936, the whispers had turned into open talk. Thomas E. Dewey wasn't just watching Luciano anymore, he was hunting him. The young special prosecutor had made a name going after bootleggers and racketeers, but those were small trophies. Dewey wanted a lion's head mounted on his wall. And in New York, there was no bigger lion than Lucky Luciano. Luciano knew the risk. For years he'd kept his distance from the dirt. No hand-to-hand deals, no paper trails, no orders given in public. But Dewey wasn't aiming to catch him in the act. Dewey wanted to build a case from the ground up: witnesses, patterns, connections, enough circumstantial evidence to turn everyone knows he's guilty into 12 jurors say he's guilty. The opening came from an angle no one expected: vice, specifically, prostitution. The business had always been around the edges of organized crime, but Luciano had never seen it as his main trade. Still, Dewey's team started linking the city's prostitution network back to him piece by piece. The claim wasn't that Luciano was running brothels himself, but that he was the man at the top, the one pulling strings and collecting tribute. It was a risky strategy for Dewey. Prostitution cases were messy, witnesses unreliable, stories conflicting. But Dewey had something else, the appetite for a headline. And in 1936, Luciano arrested would be the headline of the year. The move came in April. Luciano was in Hot Springs, Arkansas, supposedly on vacation. Federal agents and local police swarmed in the kind of arrest designed to make the front page. The story spread coast to coast, the king of the underworld in custody. They put him on a train back to New York under guard the whole way. Reporters snapped photos at every stop, calling his name, asking if he had a statement. Luciano stayed calm. Well dressed. Even smiled for the cameras. If he was rattled, he didn't show it. The trial was a spectacle. Dewey painted Luciano as the mastermind of a massive prostitution ring, claiming he controlled dozens of madams and hundreds of girls, using his influence over the underworld to keep the business running smoothly. The defense argued there was no hard evidence, no signed orders, no direct witnesses who could say they'd seen Luciano give instructions. But Dewey's witnesses, some of them women pulled straight from the brothels, told stories that painted him as untouchable, feared, and deeply involved. Day after day, the courtroom was packed. Socialites sat beside reporters, cops beside curious civilians. The jury listened as Dewey turned what might have been a thin case into a moral crusade. Luciano sat through it all, expression steady, leaning occasionally toward his lawyers but never speaking out of turn. He knew better than to let the jury see emotion, too much anger and he looked guilty, too much charm and he looked manipulative. After weeks of testimony, the jury went out. When they came back, the verdict was guilty on 62 counts. The sentence, 30 to 50 years in prison. It was a stunning blow. Not just for Luciano, but for the entire underworld. The commission had been built to prevent chaos, and now its architect was behind bars. Rivals whispered that his time was over. Allies wondered if the machine could keep running without him at the helm. Luciano was sent to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora. Little Siberia, they called it. Cold, isolated, locked down tight. But prison walls didn't mean the end. Not for Lucky. Within weeks, he'd established lines of communication with his men on the outside. Messages went through lawyers, through visiting friends, even through guards who could be persuaded with the right amount of cash. The commission still met. Decisions still got made. Luciano might be in a cell, but his reach was still felt in every racket from New York to Chicago. Still, he couldn't ignore the reality, being locked away put him at a disadvantage. Others saw opportunities in his absence. Territories shifted. Alliances frayed. The machine was still running, but without his constant hand on the wheel, small cracks began to appear. In quieter moments, he thought about how it had all come down to this. Not a street war. Not a rival's bullet. But a courtroom, a prosecutor with ambition, and a case that had been as much about making a statement as proving a crime. It was a reminder, the old enemies had been easy to see. The new ones wore suits, carried briefcases, and worked in offices with polished floors. Luciano's days of walking into a club and owning the room were over. For now, the room he owned was 8 feet by 10, with a steel door. But even from there, he wasn't finished. He still had power. He still had connections. And he still had one card left to play, the kind of card that could turn a prison sentence into a ticket back to freedom. They shipped him out, but Lucky was never the type to stop pulling strings. Prison was supposed to bury Luciano. And for a while, it looked like it might. The cold walls of Clinton Correctional Facility were a far cry from the smoky clubs and polished dining rooms he was used to. But even behind bars, Lucky kept his mind sharp and his network tighter than ever. Then came the war. In 1942, with World War II raging, U.S. naval intelligence faced a problem. German submarines were operating dangerously close to the American coastline, and they suspected sabotage in the docks. Someone in the government floated a wild idea: maybe the Mafia, with its grip on the docks and shipping unions, could help secure the waterfront. And who better to arrange that than Charles "Lucky" Luciano? Through intermediaries, naval intelligence cut a deal. Luciano would use his influence to ensure cooperation from dockworkers, prevent strikes, and keep information flowing to the authorities. In return, his prison conditions improved, and more importantly, the possibility of parole suddenly appeared on the horizon. By 1946, that possibility became reality. Officially, it was for services to the war effort. Unofficially, it was the result of a network of friends, politicians, and businessmen who still owed him. There was one catch: he wouldn't be going home. Instead, Luciano was deported to Italy, his birthplace, but a place he hadn't lived in since he was 9 years old. He arrived in Naples to a hero's welcome from some, suspicion from others. The Italian authorities kept an eye on him, but it didn't take long for him to settle into a new rhythm. Fine suits, cigarettes, long afternoons at cafes overlooking the bay, and always the phone calls. Because deportation didn't mean retirement. Luciano still had the commission in New York, and while he couldn't sit at the table, he could whisper in the ears of the men who did. Through trusted couriers, letters coded in business language, and the occasional meeting in neutral territory, he remained a force in American organized crime. He also began weaving himself into the European scene. Naples was a port city, a perfect hub for moving goods, legal or otherwise. Some of those goods were cigarettes. Others were more dangerous. Rumors swirled about his involvement in the heroin trade, using Mediterranean routes to supply the American market. He was careful, though. The Italian authorities were no less dangerous than the American ones, and with the post-war chaos, rivals were everywhere. Luciano played his usual game: quiet alliances, small moves, patience. In 1947, he took a bolder step. Havana, Cuba, was booming as a playground for the rich, and its casinos were becoming a goldmine for organized crime. Luciano, using his connections, slipped into Havana under a false passport. There, he met with top mob figures, including Meyer Lansky, to discuss consolidating control over the island's lucrative gambling operations. For a few weeks, it seemed like he was back in the center of things. Lavish dinners, strategy meetings, the buzz of big plans. But it didn't last. The U.S. caught wind of his presence and pressured the Cuban government to deport him back to Italy. It was a reminder that no matter how wide his reach, there were limits. The days of moving freely from city to city were gone. Still, influence doesn't always need presence. From Naples, he maintained regular contact with old allies, offered advice on disputes, and occasionally mediated through intermediaries when the commission faced tough decisions. His voice still carried weight even across an ocean. He also became something of a legend, the exiled king who had built the modern mafia and still somehow had a say in its affairs. Young gangsters in both America and Italy spoke his name with respect, even if they'd never met him. But exile was a double-edged sword. Without constant visibility, his grip on day-to-day operations inevitably loosened. Other bosses rose, each with their own style and ambitions. Some saw him as the wise elder, others as a relic from another era. Luciano didn't fight it. He had nothing left to prove. His life was no longer about climbing higher, it was about holding on to what mattered, keeping the right people close, and making sure no one rewrote the history he'd helped create. From his apartment in Naples, he could look out at the harbor and see ships coming and going, each one a reminder that power was never about where you stood. It was about who still listened when you spoke. And in both New York and Naples, plenty of people were still listening. Every boss has one final move. Lucky's came when no one saw it coming. By the early 1960s, Lucky Luciano was a man who had lived 3 lives: the scrappy street kid from the Lower East Side, the architect of the commission, and the exile who somehow kept a hand on the wheel of an empire from across the ocean. In Naples, his days followed a quiet rhythm: mornings at the cafe, afternoons reading newspapers from New York, evenings spent over slow dinners with a select few. But behind that calm, there was always movement. Contacts came and went. Phone calls were made at odd hours. Packages arrived from overseas that never went through customs. Luciano was still a player, not in the same loud, visible way as before, but in the manner of an elder statesman whose word could settle disputes before they became wars. Then came the last deal. Hollywood had always been fascinated by gangsters, and by the 60s producers were starting to realize there was money in telling their stories, even if those stories had to be dressed up for the censors. One such producer reached out to Luciano through an associate, proposing a film loosely based on his life. It wouldn't use his real name, but everyone would know who it was about. Luciano was intrigued. Not just for the money, though there was plenty on the table, but for the chance to shape his own legend. He'd seen what the papers had written about him, what the prosecutors had claimed, what the public believed. Now he could have a hand in how the story was told. He arranged a meeting with the producer and several intermediaries in Naples. They chose the airport as a neutral, discreet spot, public enough for safety, private enough for business. On the morning of January 26, 1962, Luciano dressed sharp as always, tailored suit, polished shoes, hat at the perfect angle. He arrived early, as was his habit, and waited near the cafe in the arrivals hall. The producer was late. Luciano lit a cigarette, scanning the crowd with the same calm, assessing eyes he'd used in speakeasies decades earlier. When the man finally arrived, they shook hands. Witnesses later said they talked for only a few minutes, voices low, gestures measured. Nothing seemed unusual, no arguments, no signs of tension. Then, mid-sentence, Luciano staggered. His cigarette slipped from his fingers. One hand went to his chest. The producer caught his arm, but it was already too late. Charles Lucky Luciano collapsed onto the tiled floor, dead of a heart attack at 64 years old. The scene was almost too neat, too cinematic, the legendary mob boss dropping in the middle of a conversation about turning his life into a movie. Some whispered that it was no accident, that maybe the meeting was a cover for something else. But the autopsy confirmed the cause, a sudden, massive heart attack. The funeral in Naples drew a mix of mourners, old friends, shadowy figures from the underworld, curious locals who'd only known him as the quiet man in the cafe. But it was in New York that his passing was felt most deeply. For all the miles between them, his influence had never really left the city. In the days after his death, newspapers ran long retrospectives, some painting him as a ruthless criminal, others as a visionary who had brought order to chaos. Few could deny that he'd changed the shape of organized crime forever. For Luciano, there was no dramatic final shootout, no betrayal in a dark alley. His end was quiet, almost dignified, the way a man like him might have chosen if he'd been given the option. Still, his death marked more than the loss of a person. It marked the closing of a chapter in the history of the American Mafia. The commission he had built would continue, but without his guiding hand, cracks would begin to show. The balance he'd worked so hard to maintain would tilt, slowly at first, then faster in the turbulent years to come. In Naples, the cafe where he'd spent his mornings kept his usual table empty for weeks. In New York, in the bars and clubs where his name was still spoken in careful tones, glasses were raised in his honor. And in the underworld, the lesson of his life and his death lingered: power isn't about how loud you speak, or how many men you command. It's about making the world move the way you want it to and leaving a shadow big enough that it stays long after you're gone. Men like Lucky, they don't just disappear. They leave shadows that never fade. In the years after his death, Charles Lucky Luciano became more than a man. He became a story, told in whispers in dimly lit bars, in embellished tales over poker tables, in history books that tried to separate fact from legend. The empire he had helped design didn't crumble overnight. The commission he created still met, still made decisions, still settled disputes. The names around the table changed, but the structure remained a testament to his vision. In New York, some bosses still quoted him, "Keep your friends close, but your business closer." Others followed his rules without even realizing whose they were. The practice of avoiding all-out street wars, of settling things in a room before they spilled onto the sidewalk, was his legacy in motion. The public, too, couldn't let him go. Hollywood found him irresistible, the charming, dangerous architect of modern organized crime. Movies and television shows borrowed from his life, changing names and details but always chasing that same magnetic blend of style and menace. Even decades later, when younger audiences saw a fictional mob boss make a quiet deal in a backroom, they were in some way seeing a shadow of Lucky Luciano. But legends have a way of bending with time. Some painted him as a cold-blooded killer who dressed up crime as organization. Others as a pragmatic leader who brought stability to a violent world. The truth, as always, lived somewhere between those extremes. In Naples, the cafes where he had once sat were still there, their tables now hosting tourists who had no idea they were drinking coffee where one of the most powerful men in the world had once done business. The locals remembered, though. The old waiters, the street vendors, they'd point quietly to a corner table and say, "That's where he sat." In New York, older mobsters would still talk about him like he was in the next room. If Lucky was here, they'd say, this mess wouldn't be happening. Whether that was true or not didn't matter. What mattered was the belief, the idea that there had once been a man who could keep the chaos in check. His rules had been simple but lasting: no unnecessary bloodshed, business before ego, diversity in partnerships if it meant bigger profits, and above all, discretion. These principles outlived him, carried forward by men who had never even met him. Some followed them because they worked. Others because they feared what might happen if they didn't. But the world he left behind was changing. Law enforcement was adapting. Surveillance was getting sharper. And the next generations of gangsters weren't always as disciplined. The commission still functioned, but cracks would form, the kind of cracks Luciano might have sealed before they became fractures. Even so, his blueprint endured. The Mafia in America was no longer a collection of feuding street gangs. It was a network, an institution, a business, one that operated for decades under the structure he had imagined in a hospital bed after his near assassination. The final irony? For all the laws he broke, for all the enemies he made, Luciano died a free man, not in prison, not in a hail of bullets, but in a public place, wearing a good suit, talking business. Few in his line of work ever got that ending. Today, his name still carries weight. Historians dissect his moves like a grandmaster's chess game. Crime writers trace the bloodlines of modern syndicates back to his era. Filmmakers borrow his charm, his calculated calm, his way of letting silence speak louder than threats. And somewhere in that, his presence remains, in the rules still followed, in the stories still told, in the quiet nods exchanged when his name comes up among those who know. Because men like Lucky Luciano don't just disappear. They leave shadows long enough to stretch across oceans. And if you walk the right streets in New York, or sit in the right cafe in Naples, and you listen closely enough, you might still feel him there.